I do assume indeed, that we are opening this session, the need for cross-sectoral accountability no more than ever. I would like, to thank all those who have been able to find the time to join us at this meeting, because I do have indeed an interesting panel waiting for you. My name is Jean-Luc Lemayeux. I was appointed director within the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime since December 2013. Before that, I've been serving in many countries, such as in Central Asia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and the Caribbean. Now, you have been looking in this session because of your interest in the C20. And just let me remind you a bit what the C20 is about. It is the abbreviation of the Civil 20, an independent engagement group of the G20, and a global platform for civil society organizations, delivering civil society's demands to world leaders within the G20. The C20 community comprised of well over 1,000 civil society organizations from all corners of the world, which have been channeling the voice of civil society into the G20 process since 2013. Now, each year, C20 convenes voices from civil society groups, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, global policy experts, and G20 senior officials. You just name it. We try to broaden the discussion away from the formal institutional frameworks and have activists, influencers, people like you to collaborate to influence the policy solutions required. This topic is important, otherwise you would not be with us, so we are very happy to have you. Accountability is a foundational element of the effectiveness and good governance, and now more than ever with the pandemic looming in front of us and the implications that we do here. We hear figures of 70 to 100 million people risking to fall back in poverty due to the economic consequence of the pandemic. Transparency, accountability of governments is absolutely vital. Even more so in the light of the ongoing deteriorating human rights conditions and the reduction of the civil space in which we often find ourselves globally. So legal frameworks and solutions must be implemented that result in transparency, in fairness, promote integrity, promote trust among the different sectoral groups. Corruption has simply no place in an era where every penny needs to be spent to those who foremost need it, thereby fighting inequality and avoiding ultimately political instability. So this session aims to stress the importance of enhancing governmental accountability and transparency, and we will try to see where there is room for improvement and where we want to see the G20 committing themselves on with regard to what needs to be done in concrete, practical terms. Myself working for UNODC, I would remain amiss if I do not mention the UN Convention Against Corruption, which was ratified in 2005, and especially its Article 13. Why do I mention that article? Because it specifically indicates a role for civil society in combating corruption by calling on governments to increase transparency, promote the active participation of civil society in government decision-making processes, and ensure public access to information. Since then, and some of you might know because might be taking part in this, we do have a mechanism to review the effective implementation of the convention, and we support civil society, academia, and the private sector since 2011 to get involved in that process. We have organized 25 multi-stakeholder workshops on the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and its review mechanism, and we have trained about 500 civil society organizations globally alongside with the governments and the private sector. So hopefully, if you have not participated in that exercise, you might do in the future. Now, you might know as well that within the United Nations framework, we are gearing up towards a General Assembly special session against corruption, UNGAS 2021, which will take place in June. And we are already working on a meaningful content for that special session. And if you would like to participate and contribute to that, you can go to our website and hopefully find more. This said, a final note of interest: next to the OECD, IMF, and the World Bank, UNITC is one of the only 4 international organizations invited to be permanent observers to the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, and we do all 4 actively contribute to the work of the group on a continual basis, and hopefully get inspired by the discussion today to bring that forward with us. That was the introduction. Let me now get to tell you who the panel members are, and I would like to express my gratitude for each of them to join us here today. We have Gavin Heyman, who is the Executive Director of Open Contracting Partnerships. And before joining the Open Contracting Partnerships, Gavin was Director of Campaigns and then Executive Director of Global Witness. He helped create the international Publish What You Pay campaign and negotiate the Intergovernmental Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, an extremely important step forward in getting more transparency within that sector of the industry. He is an expert on illicit financial flows and supports global efforts to end the abuse of anonymous shell companies for money laundering and financial crime. Gavin, welcome. Second person which I see in the panel, and I'm very delighted to introduce to you, is Vivek Ramkumar, who is Senior Director of Policy of the International Budget Partnership. Now, Vivek joined the International Budget Partnership in 2005 and currently is Senior Director of Policy. In this capacity, he oversees its research and advocacy to expand the adoption of transparent and accountable budget systems around the world. Vivek previously worked with the MKSS, an organization that pioneered the right to information movement in India. He also worked with a Mumbai-based non-governmental organization called Spark, and which is part of the Shak Slum Dwellers International. Vivek, happy to see you here, and we will hear from you more. Further in alphabetical order is Tracy Staines, who is the Acting Inspector General of the Global Fund. And Tracy is a chartered accountant with over 20 years experience in audit, governance, and risk management. Tracy is currently the Acting Inspector General at the Global Fund in Geneva, an international organization that you definitely must know, raising and investing nearly $4 billion a year to accelerate the end of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria epidemics. Now, prior to this, Tracy led large multidisciplinary teams in the UK civil service and the financial services sector, specializing in governance, risk management, and internal control. Tracy, very happy to have you here. And that leaves me then, last but not least, Rhoda Weeks-Brown, who is the General Counsel and Director of Legal Department of the International Monetary Fund. As I said, being the General Counsel Director of the IMF's Legal Department, she advises the IMF's Executive Board, management, staff, and country membership on all legal aspects of the IMF's operations, including its lending, regulatory, and advisory functions. Ms. Weeks-Brown was named one of the top 27 global general counsels 2020 by the Financial Times, and one of the top 5 general counsels in the area of promoting ethical standards. She serves on the board of Talentnomics Incorporation, a non-profit organization focused on developing women leaders globally. Rhoda, very happy to have you on board. So those are the 4 panel members, and it is really my pleasure and my honor to be moderating this panel. Now, before I fire off the questions, I will tell you a little bit more of the logistics so that we can have a very useful, efficient session all together, which we will enjoy. There will be 8 questions raised, 2 for each of the panel members. We do invite them to be concise within 5 minutes. The remainder of the time then within the session will be used to allow our audience to raise any queries they might have. And if you do so, you do have the chat available to you. In the chat box, you are invited as well to indicate with whom or to whom you direct your question within the panel. So don't raise the question only, but as well, I mean, if you would like to have this going to Rhoda, to Tracy, to Vivek, or to Gavin, I mean, please indicate the same. We do encourage everybody of the audience, I mean, to keep your cameras and your mute on, so that will allow us to have a broader bandwidth and an optimal connection to all. Voila, so far for the large introduction. And now we get really to the meat of this session here, the questions, inviting our expert panel members to come forward with some of their answers and views and experiences they might have. The first question, Vivek, is to you. And the question is the following. What are the concerns of civil society when it comes to global accountability, especially during a crisis with unprecedented levels of emergency public spending and financing as we do witness today? Vivek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Luc, and hello, everyone. It may be cliched to say it, but it still merits repeating that the world has changed in ways that few of us could have imagined at the start of this year. But I want to remind everyone that even before the COVID-19 crisis began, there were signs of turmoil around the world. Last year, French neighborhoods were rocked by the Yellow Vest protests. In Chile, 1 million people took to the streets over a subway fare increase, while in Korea and Iraq, corruption scandals led to massive street demonstrations. The scale of these popular mobilizations that occurred in more than a dozen countries point to the economic hardship, blatant inequality, and perceived corruption of political elites that many communities were already feeling. The health and economic impact of the COVID pandemic has magnified these issues and the hardships that millions of our fellow human beings are confronting. My organization, the International Budget Partnership, works with a network of civil society organizations across 120 countries. Our partners have voiced several concerns since the start of the pandemic. These include specific issues related to inequity in planning and corruption in the delivery of emergency measures, alongside broader concerns, including the opacity surrounding emergency measures and the increasingly constrained spaces for civic engagement. Let me elaborate on these points. First, civil society groups lack information regarding what their governments are doing to support their populations. Earlier this year, we published the results from our latest open budget survey on the state of transparency, public engagement, and oversight in government budgeting systems. The average scores received by 117 countries on budget transparency is only 45 out of 100. While on public participation, countries score a dismal 14 out of 100. In practical terms, what these scores mean is that for large sections of the populations in many countries, especially those with modest means, for whom publicly funded services are most critical, budgets remain a remote and complicated process, one that is neither clearly explained nor open for discussion. Although the survey was conducted prior to the COVID-19 crisis, the findings from the survey point to threats that can undermine the effectiveness of the fiscal measures being proposed by governments to alleviate the suffering in their countries. Emergency spending is going to be harder to track, as budget transparency tends to be more limited on budget execution than on plans. This problem is compounded due to weak oversight roles played by legislatures and supreme audit institutions. Further, many governments are establishing extra budgetary funds and incurring debt to channel emergency spending. The Open Budget Survey finds that these types of funds and government debt are generally inadequately disclosed by governments. A second concern expressed by many of our partner organizations is around poorly designed emergency measures that will exacerbate inequality and leave people behind. For example, in Senegal, people with disabilities were in danger of being left out of the government's COVID-19 response package until civil society groups intervened. Civil society organizations are also concerned about corruption and mismanagement of emergency funds. Recently, in the Gambia, civil society groups released a report with findings on large-scale mismanagement of COVID-19 related funds. Finally, many of our partner organizations are concerned about the steps being taken by some governments to prevent people from mobilizing as they demand justice and try to make their voices heard. For example, many civil society organizations have raised concerns about lack of civic spaces in Saudi Arabia, the host country of today's event. In fact, the country scores 0 on public participation in our survey. While less extreme in other countries, the challenges around civic mobilization are prevalent globally and must be addressed. Let us be clear that justice has a significant fiscal dimension, and fiscal justice cannot be achieved without the active participation of communities suffering injustice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivek. And indeed, I mean, justice has a significant fiscal dimension, and the civil society role is so important in this. I mean, let me therefore continue and raise the second question as well to you. According to you, what reform commitments are needed from the international community at large, and specifically the G20, to whom we focus the outcome of this session? What is required, I mean, to ensure accountability, trust, and transparency across sectors? Vivek?
Thank you. Let me start answering this question with the good news. Countries around the world have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic by announcing major new spending initiatives to alleviate suffering. Donors have also announced aid packages and offered debt relief to help countries channel additional monies to address the profound consequences of this crisis. These swift developments are welcome. But as the crisis intensifies, much more remains to be done to ensure that no one is left behind. The one thing that the pandemic and the variety of government responses to the emergency have made clear is how critical national budgets are to providing support to those immediately affected and to rebuilding economies. Unfortunately, given the pressure to respond in a timely way, in many cases, the budget responses to the emergency have also been closed processes. Opening budget processes to civic engagement creates a unique opportunity to drive the economic recovery while also strengthening democracies. We have an opportunity to mend broken social contracts and reconnect stakeholders in ways that promote everyone's well-being. How governments channel public resources towards relief efforts will, in many cases, have a crucial impact on how many lives are saved and how many people fall into poverty. Choices regarding the formulation and implementation of relief expenditures are too important to be made opaquely and without public input, especially when inequality and perceived corruption have already undermined public trust in many governments. It's against this backdrop that my organization, together with civil society groups in over 100 countries, as well as dozens of international organizations, is calling for a global effort to accelerate progress and deliver the promises of open budgeting to all citizens. We're also calling for the creation of stronger interlinkages between various actors, including legislatures, supreme audit institutions, and civil society organizations, so that they operate as part of a strong accountability ecosystem. More specifically, we seek 4 ambitious but attainable targets within the next 5 years to increase transparency, public engagement, and oversight in government budgets. First, government should publish information on how public resources are generated, allocated, and spent in a timely manner that is accessible to all. Next April, we plan to release a special COVID edition of the Open Budget Survey that will provide data on how transparent and accountable governments have been on their COVID-related finances. We urge the G20 to use this data to promote greater transparency and accountability. Second, government should create opportunities for all people, particularly those from marginalized communities, to provide input into the budget process. This needs to be accompanied by concrete steps to ensure that civil society organizations can function freely. There's growing evidence that civic engagement in shaping and monitoring the COVID-19 fiscal measures is contributing to a more effective and accountable pandemic response and recovery. In Indonesia, civil society groups surveyed thousands of people in urban low-income communities and is engaging with the government to ensure effective delivery of the Emergency Cash Assistance Program. In South Africa, hotspots identified by civil society organizations that are tracking water, toilet, and waste facilities are helping national, provincial, and city agencies to improve services for thousands of people in informal settlements. Third, monitoring and oversight of budget execution through independent bodies, especially supreme audit institutions, needs to be strengthened. Next month, we will release a report that shows key gaps in government audit systems and offer a set of recommendations on how these gaps can be covered. The G20 members should prioritize independent and effective functioning of audit systems within their own countries and in other countries. And finally, countries need to sustain improvements achieved on open budgeting and protect them from political shifts. In conclusion, let me emphasize that open budgeting is essential to help with the recovery efforts underway. It enables more investment, more information for better decisions, and more efficiency. And importantly, it creates stronger linkages between different actors in the accountability ecosystem throughout the budget cycle, from planning and execution to oversight. To achieve open budgets, we call on the G20 to endorse our call to action and to take concrete steps to institutionalize open budgeting practices within their own budgeting systems and to provide technical support and political encouragement to other countries to take similar steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivek. And indeed, a call to see this pandemic as well as an opportunity to instill trust by opening the budget processes to civic engagement. Extremely interesting. Much grateful for this. And it links to the third question. Tracy, a question for you. We heard already some of that, but how would you see the benefits from achieving accountability, trust, and transparency across all those sectors? What would you see as the tangible benefits out of that process? Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to everybody, and thanks for making the time. I think those comments by Vivek are just fabulous in terms of setting the scene for this conversation today. As Jean-Luc said, I'm Tracy Staines, the Acting Inspector General for the OIG at the Global Fund, an organisation many of you know. Obviously, we're helping our recipient countries in tackling COVID, as well as limiting the impact for C19 on our own programs. So it's a really busy time for us, as you can imagine. And I think this topic couldn't come at a better time, frankly. As the Inspector General, I oversee all of the grant programs to safeguard assets, investments, and reputation and sustainability of the Global Fund. And as Jean-Luc says, I've been asked to say a few words on the benefits of achieving accountability, trust, and transparency across the sectors. This is clearly a very complex topic, and I've got the whole of 5 minutes to cover it. So you'll have to forgive me for talking very quickly and for addressing some of the points at a high level. But we can always take questions after this. So let me start by saying, of course, there are many benefits for these things, but I think for me, I want to outline 3 benefits for 3 distinct groups that in my mind include the implementer group, the donor group, and overall for funding organisations. But of course, these aspects are clearly beneficial across all sectors. If we can start with implementers, for me, the biggest and most important benefit is impact. We see that an increase in trust and transparency, especially with civil society, can directly contribute towards saving lives. And I think Vivek touched on this in the last session. In this, I mean there is a clear correlation between the impact of programmes and the level of trust and transparency at the country levels. We see this in countries that score highly on the Transparency Index, for example. The second benefit is that we avoid donor darlings or donor orphans. What does that mean? Well, if there's a lack of transparency about aid resources, that creates an imbalance in aid, where the aid funds flows disproportionately to particular regions, sectors, issues, or ministries. And following on from my previous point, an increase in trust and accountability levels across the board helps avoid situations where trusted countries or more trusted countries are awarded bigger shares of the funding. This means that there will be an imbalance for those countries where there's more of a challenging operating environment, understandable from a donor perspective, perhaps in terms of risk, but not good for equity. And then the last benefit for the implementers to me is around predictability. Better visibility of aid allows recipients to improve financial planning and avoids risking that government officials invest less in future planning processes. Having better transparency of fund flows at a country level is clearly beneficial for implemented countries. Moving on to the funding organisations, such as the organisation that I work for, the Global Fund, or organisations such as Gavi, a higher standard of accountability, trust and transparency increases donor confidence in our organisations, and that has to be a good thing. Aid transparency is tracked by Publish What You Fund, for example, and it's a badge of honour for our organisations to score highly on that, because there is a direct correlation in terms of funding. Again, there's a clear delineation between the level of transparencies and the level of funding that those organisations can attract. Secondly, I believe very strongly in strong and robust internal controls, as I would as an Inspector General, but I think it's indicative of organisational maturity. What do I mean by that? Stronger organisations tend to have more independent oversight bodies. And there's many case studies of corporate failures, for example, that had weak oversight structures in common. And then third for me around funding organisation is around data reliability. It's critical to inform strategic cross-sector decision-making, and that's even more important in a C19 context. The more reliable your data is, the better quality of decisions made across the sector. And that's, again, very important in terms of COVID. And then lastly, for the donor community, high levels of trust and transparency really does lend itself to more efficient and effective use of resources. Donors often fund multiple same sector projects, and lack of visibility can hinder impact and value there. There's a clear benefit for donors in having transparency, because it means they can better follow what other donors are, where other donors are placing their money. And this avoids funding the same programs, but in worst case, things like double dipping, for example. There's also a benefit in conducting transparent, sector-specific and cross-sectoral learning and evaluation exercises. Second, in terms of donors, in terms of public support, transparency helps maintain that public support for aid programs that we all really, really need. Having robust mechanisms to root out problems proactively and to tell taxpayers where their money is going clearly helps boost the confidence that the public has in those government spendings. And then lastly, around just self-identifying issues, it's far better to report on the facts yourself than have your problems misreported or released by the media. It's preferable from our perspective to be able to put the full facts out as opposed to getting broken on CNN, especially if that means that the facts are not reported accurately. So I'm going to finish there and pass back to Jean-Luc. But any questions on this, I'm happy to field later on.
Thank you very much, Tracy. That was indeed, very interesting and a good follow-up on what Vivek was laying out as well. Accountability, integrity is absolutely necessary to instill the public trust, the confidence in the government. I heard as well the remark on organization maturity. And Gavin, if you allow me to come to you, to ensure accountability, transparency, and integrity, how would a legal and reporting framework, an institutional structure, a strategy ensuring accountability look like in your views? Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So that's a wonderfully broad question. So to answer it, I'd say I'm a really big believer in trying to think about the intelligent design of the whole architecture of the system. So how the laws, the policies, reporting, and really importantly, the feedback loops, so that people take the information and act on it to do something, fit together and reinforce each other. So key to that kind of intelligent design is really that collaboration across government, business, and civil society to think about what do users need and how will you take each piece of information and who will do what with that, and with whom will they speak, and then what would happen afterwards. So you really need to think about that whole approach. And it's not just about increasing transparency, it's about how you convert that transparency into accountability by creating additional improved agency. So just like Tracy was sharing with us a moment ago, the importance of the oversight and feedback actors. There's a way that information is generated they can act on. If there's fraud detected, it's flagged to them so they can act quickly to address it. So we really need to think about that kind of intelligent design of the system. Throughout my career, I've often dealt with situations where it's just been a patchwork of different small fixes and the whole system isn't really put together coherently. So to give you a simple example, looking at the beneficial owners of companies, maybe the threshold of reporting those beneficial owners is so high that you're not actually picking up, for example, conflicts of interest from government officials because they have quite a small beneficial interest in a particular company or vehicle for corruption. So that kind of intelligent design is really necessary. And I'm a big believer in thinking about how you provide information that meets the user where they are. So people often expect, I'll publish and somehow something magical will happen. People use that information and it will turn into accountability. It doesn't happen that way. You have to give it to people directly and meet them in the trenches where they're just trying to survive or trying to perform their jobs and make it relevant and at the level of information and granularity that's useful to them. So that's kind of my pitch for the intelligent design approach, so thinking about kind of anti-corruption and accountability reforms. I also think beyond that kind of approach, we have to understand the political economy and power dynamics that go on as well. So we're all familiar with loads of great laws on the books that aren't enforced and are kind of toothless. So we, as the international community, we spend a lot of time thinking about the formal structures and not really enough, to my mind, thinking about the power dynamics and the kind of incentives of different actors to avoid accountability. And that often ends up with us going, didn't work, we need more political leadership and moving on. So we really need to understand that kind of political economy dynamic before perhaps we try to sort of fix things. And put really simply, the way you address that is to make sure from the reforms, when you work with government, business, civil society, there are a sufficient number of new winners from the improved governance that they could kind of overpower, to be crude about it, or outmaneuver the beneficiaries from the old corrupt system. So I think that's really important as well. So intelligent design, understanding the power dynamics, making sure there are more winners, even as winners are more dispersed, that we give them voice and agency so they can do something. So to give you an example that relates particularly to COVID, I work on public contracting. So public procurement is government's #1 corruption risk. That's even before the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic has resulted in massive accelerated emergency procurement and spending, which has hugely increased those risks. And I know that everyone watching this at home would know of from some particular fraud or misspending in their own particular country. One of my own, personal ones I was really shocked by was looking at, for example, a Bosnian raspberry farm that got a multi-million-dollar contract for providing intensive care unit ventilators. So clearly that's absolutely bonkers, but we all have troubles with it. In the UK, there's been multiple different examples. So the Open Contracting Partnership, we are really trying to reform the whole process of public procurement. It's been a paper-based, compliance-based chore for too long. We're really trying to rethink it as a smart digital service around users. So to give an example of that, we're taking both an open data and an open government approach. The open data approach is through our open contracting data standard to precisely describe the exact piece of information that people might want about public contracts, and to make those machine readable and reusable and repackageable, so you can effectively share the right information with the right people at the right time. And the open government approach is precisely working with everyone across the entire chain of public contracting to design the information flow, the red flags, the warning systems, that are useful to them in their jobs. So different users have different needs. A small business, for example, looking for a contract might need it beamed on their phone to tell them to bid in real time. A community monitoring group might need the whole contract and specific clauses in it on paper. A government itself trying to observe procurement might need a real-time dashboard with red flags embedded in it and say, there's an anonymous contract award that's 10 times the usual price for to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, please act on this. So it's really thinking about those dynamics. And we've seen how important that's been in the COVID-19 situation, because you've had this incredible shock to public procurement. Those countries with good data structures have been able to respond very rapidly, very quickly, and very effectively. They've been able to use their digital frameworks to have buyers meet suppliers in real time and to publish their emergency procurements in less than 24 hours. So they've been able to buy fast, but also buy openly and transparently. Corruption has been detected and been acted on. And again, there's been complaints mechanisms and other things for people to be able to act upon if they feel that there's been dubious dealings. And so there's real power behind this. And what's fascinating to me is we're able to see that from countries as far apart as maybe Afghanistan, right, on one side, through to Colombia in Latin America, or Ukraine, or Lithuania in Europe. So it really shows that if you get good data and you think intelligently about the system, that's really powerful. We are now moving to the reform part, and hopefully, in due course, there will be a vaccine. We'll be looking then at the fundamental weaknesses of the system, and that's where the power dynamics are so important. So really trying to build that whole cohort of reformers in government, outside government, the businesses that have been cut out of the loop in public contracts in the past, and building a kind of coalition of the willing to create that long-term strategic change. And every time we've seen these changes go deep, that's been a really important part of it. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Great information to the right people at the right time with good feedback loops and understanding the power dynamics and incentives that underpin it.
Gavin, that's fascinating. Thank you very much. And that's a limited time, sketching out all what we need. But evidently, Gavin, as you do know, and you mentioned some of those countries in which we witness some specific problems because of institutional weaknesses. And that's an area where the Global Funds is, of course, very much working at and working in. And Tracy, if I can come back to you on the same, very interesting what Gavin laid out, but out of your own experience, how can you see that those complexities and challenges hindering accountability can be eliminated and addressed in concrete terms? Tracy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Luc, and thanks to Gavin. That was fascinating. I think in terms of what you were saying just then, Jean-Luc, the Global Fund works in some of the most challenging countries in the world. And, I think those complexities and challenges should never be underestimated. So I've noted down for you today just a couple of the things that I think would really help to sort of how we can kind of address some of those things that hinder accountability. So first and foremost, I'm a really strong believer in setting clear standards and procedures. What do I mean by that? Well, the development world is frankly complex enough, but even more so when there's a lack of clear guidance on what is required. It's critical here to ensure that the rules of the game are understood by everybody and clearly laid out so that roles and responsibilities are well understood and that accountability can be clearly articulated. As I mentioned before, putting in place effective oversight mechanisms, and I'm going to emphasize effective there, is really important because accountability is clearer and oversight mechanisms are robust, competent and independent. There's nothing worse than having a seemingly robust oversight mechanism and it performing badly, either in missing key issues or even worse, over dramatizing an issue and not balancing it given the current context. Thirdly, I think encouraging training and knowledge sharing always helps break down barriers, and working on complex issues and in difficult environments, as Jean-Luc said earlier, can really hinder effective knowledge transfer and sharing of good practices. So, for example, conducting training and sharing lessons learned can really help to break down some of those challenges that we all face. There was a question in the chat, I think, from Khalid around how can civil society, really contribute to saving lives? Well, my first answer there would be encourage participation. And I think this is really important in breaking down barriers to accountability, working with all partners and stakeholders and ensuring that all views are heard helps to unearth the issues, drive better accountability, and result in more inclusive decisions and buy-in to action plans. I can't stress this enough. As an organisation such as the Global Fund, which was founded on the principle of inclusivity, there is really, really tangible benefits to be had from that. And I do think lack of inclusivity and lack of participation does hinder accountability. In the Global Fund case, our disease responses are made far richer by having the participation of communities and people living with or affected by the diseases than it would be if solutions were bilaterally designed. Fourthly, for me, it's around innovation, and I think this is where civil society can be extremely helpful. Partners on the ground, especially civil society, can find innovative ways of tackling issues that, frankly, people outside of that region or outside of the issue can really understand. We should really be encouraging local solutions where possible. And we see examples of this all of the time at the OIG, from contact tracing to innovation around how we can get best results at the community level. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, I see, one of the ways that we can help with accountability and trust is to really celebrate and learn from success stories. We could all be better at studying good practices and learning about key success factors. And by this, I think I kind of feel like it should be a life motto as far as I'm concerned, just having that environment where we recognize the benefits of what others can bring and the humility to admit that we don't know all of the answers and maybe someone else has a better way of doing something. So I think, this can really help to break down the barriers in terms of accountability. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tracy. And again, this moves nicely forward in certain very concrete manners. And that's why, Rhoda, if I can raise the next question with you. The IMF has a framework on enhanced engagement on governance and corruption. Now, how do you then, as IMF, strengthen accountability in member countries in that concrete manner within that framework? Rhoda, the floor is yours.
Super. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Luc, and good morning to everyone. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you all today. Thanks to the C20 for inviting me. Thanks to my wonderful fellow panelists who have made some very important interventions already. Jean-Luc, yes, the IMF does have a framework for what we call enhanced engagement on governance and corruption. It was adopted by our board about 2.5 years ago in 2018. This framework guides all of the work that the IMF does with our member countries on issues around governance and corruption. And that includes our response to the COVID-19 crisis. And I think we'll all agree, as a couple of panelists have already noted, that these kinds of issues around governance, and in our case also anti-corruption, these are more important than ever before, given the devastating economic effects of this pandemic. So in terms of just a bit of background, this 2018 policy that I mentioned, it reflects a recognition that bad governance and corruption issues are not only issues that affect society and countries profoundly, but they also have a very profound economic effect. And therefore, they undermine the IMF's mandate, which is to help to promote global economic stability, and especially to help our member countries to achieve sustainable and inclusive economic growth. Without that growth, citizens cannot progress, countries cannot progress. So again, we're very much focused on these governance and corruption issues because of that direct economic link. We can talk about the huge cost of corruption. I don't have enough time with the 5 minutes to go into all of the research, but the costs are just devastating. Some of the most recent research we've done at the IMF shows that if countries just perform better compared to some other countries, we could gain $1 trillion in lost tax revenues from that change. And this is about 1.25% of global GDP. We have lots of studies showing the devastating impact on education and health, particularly in low-income countries, from reduced spending in those areas as a result of issues around governance, and the huge gains that can be made, including in reducing inequality, if we could improve performance in that respect. And then also by breeding distrust in government, we also see that corruption can undermine a state's capacity to undertake vital redistributive goals, which again are so critical in so many of our member countries. So again, I can't go into all the details, but just to say there's a whole lot at stake from an economic perspective. And this policy tries to address that by engaging with our member countries on these issues around governance, corruption, and also ultimately it's about accountability. In doing this, we focus not just on corruption, but we also focus on governance vulnerabilities more generally, because our experience shows this issue is not something you can treat as just a crime, prosecute people, put them in jail. Most countries have profound governance vulnerabilities, and that's the way that corruption sort of thrives in the first place. So we focus on corruption, but we also focus on governance vulnerabilities in some key state functions. So for example, we look at issues around fiscal governance. We look at issues around AML-CFT, which is very important as a way to provide protections. We look at issues around the rule of law, with particular focus on property rights, on contract rights in those kinds of issues. And we also look at the demand, not just the demand side, but also the supply side of corruption, transnational aspects, not only what's happening in countries experiencing corruption, but what are other countries doing to prevent their companies, for example, from bribing foreign public officials in other countries, or to prevent the concealment of the proceeds of corruption. And in the context of the COVID crisis, we've been implementing this policy again in all aspects of our work, both before and during the crisis. Again, in terms of how we do this, even before the crisis, the IMF has these annual consultations with our members where we discuss economic issues. And these issues around governance and anti-corruption are front and center in all of our discussions with countries for whom these issues are very relevant in the economic sense that I mentioned before. So we have dozens of recent reports that you'll see over the last couple of years that have in-depth discussions on these issues. We also have discussions on the transnational aspects that I referred to earlier. So the recent Article 4 staff reports for all of the G7 countries, as well as for Switzerland, Austria, Czech Republic, discussions around those issues as well. We deal with these issues as well in our traditional IMF lending programs, where we have conditionality focused on these vulnerabilities, again, were identified as critical issues for the country's economic program. An important point is also that we provide quite a lot of capacity development assistance on these issues, both in terms of all of the areas of both governance and anti-corruption that I talked about. And again, even now in the COVID crisis, we're continuing to provide capacity development virtually. So we have virtual meetings, and they're very in-depth and very intense on these issues. An important product that we're especially proud of and excited about are what we call our governance diagnostic reports. These are very deep dive reports that analyze all aspects of these issues in a country and basically come up with a roadmap for how to begin addressing them. As we all know, this is a long game, but these reports help to put in place a sort of roadmap and a template. And we've done those in several of our member countries, and we'll be hoping to do more in the future. One important point I should make also is that all of this work that we do, but certainly especially these governance diagnostics, but really all of our work requires very close collaboration with other partners. CSOs are a critical part of our work in this area. The local CSOs and other citizen groups in countries understand these issues more profoundly than we can, obviously. We bring the expertise, but we do work very closely with on-ground experts. And again, for us, CSOs are a key counterpart, but of course also our other partners, the World Bank, the OECD, UNODC, Jean-Luc's institution, is one that we also work closely with in some aspects of this. So again, it's very much a global effort. The fund is doing its part. And when we look ahead, just very quickly, at some of the issues that will continue to be front and center, we just did an update on the implementation of this policy for our board. The IMF, of course, we need to continue doing our part. And as I mentioned, we will continue doing that, working closely with everyone and enhanced now by the COVID crisis. But we know that also that in many countries, we need to continue working around issues of ownership and the need for sustained efforts by our country authorities, because this is a very difficult issue in a number of countries. And with respect to the COVID response, a big part of what we're going to be focusing on going forward is also the implementation of the commitments that our member countries are making in the context of COVID. So I will stop here, but just really to say that this is so important, so profoundly important. And for the IMF, it's been a huge part of our agenda for helping our member countries. Thank you, Jean-Luc. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. And indeed, a lot to be said and be told on all those issues which are taking our attention even more today with the pandemic. And you mentioned and referred to the same. I mean, you of course, have mentioned the fact that IMF is gearing up in multiple manners. I mean, now that we have the economic recovery programs lined up. I mean, you have the stimuli programs. We have in the health sector quite some investment. But I would like to hear, I mean, has IMF done something particular with regard to this aim to reduce the risk of misuse of all that emergency financing? I mean, there is quite a reliance on you, the IMF, I mean, to come forward and help many countries. I mean, there are discussions ongoing with regard from remittances to debt. I mean, you just name it. But is the IMF gearing up with regard to COVID-19 and has something which you could share with us, with this audience on specifically to COVID-19 and measures being put in place?
No, thanks, Jean-Luc. That's a very important question. And yes, the short answer is very much we're doing quite a bit around issues of governance and accountability in our emergency financing. But maybe let me just start by stepping back a bit and just reminding of how, in some ways, the economic impact of this crisis, it's a health crisis, but it's also a profound economic crisis of a kind we haven't seen before in many ways. And, there's so many dimensions of that, but just quickly to mention 3 dimensions. First of all, as we all know, governments have had to take a greater role, and they've pumped around, I think the number right now is 12 trillion into economies around the globe. Central banks have been providing massive liquidity. So this expanded role of governments is, of course, quite appropriate, and it's something the IMF has been calling for and supporting. But of course, it also creates more opportunities for misuse. And so these measures need to be accompanied by strong governance controls, timely and transparent reporting, as well as ex post audits. And that's something we've been promoting. I'll say a little bit more in a second. But another sort of a second really critical aspect of this pandemic has been the risk of severe economic scarring in the future as a result of this, a major setback in living standards and in the fight against inequality, and also particularly striking, decades-long declining trend in global poverty is now set to reverse, again, for the first time in decades, where we could actually see people falling into extreme poverty, an increase in the number of people falling into extreme poverty. So again, obviously, in the face of these sort of negative impacts, it's critical to avoid waste and leakage of funds. And then the third thing, and I alluded to this briefly earlier, but the public's trust in government can be especially tested during crisis times. And no exaggeration to say that, increases in episodes of corruption could bring about significant unrest in some countries. And we've seen some of that already. So with this backdrop in mind, again, these devastating economic and potential social impacts, we've looked at this as a crisis like no other. And in response, the IMF has responded like no other, like it never has before. One part of it has been the speed of our response and the amount of resources we provided. Just in emergency financing alone, we've already helped almost 80 countries with over $30 billion, and we continue to be actively engaged. And we've provided a lot more assistance more generally, not just in these emergency financing, but our longer multi-year financing programs. The emergency financing that we provide is a one-off disbursement. Again, it's urgent financing. It's to meet an urgent balance of payments need. It's not the multi-year arrangements that many of you on the call would be used to, where we have a 3-year arrangement with very detailed tranches that we give the relief and also see conditions imposed. But despite the emergency financing being one-off, we've been very insistent on having safeguards. Our message to countries has been spend what you need, but spend it wisely and keep the receipts. So a lot of our safeguards have been around issues of keeping the receipts and how we can vet that ex post. And so we've had commitments in a number, in substantially all of the emergency financing we provided, where countries in the letters of intent to the IMF have made very important commitments that we are really following on and will be following on in the implementation. And of course, with the help of civil society as part of this process. But what are some of these commitments that have been made in the letters of intent? First, governments have committed that the assistance they receive for this emergency assistance is going to be used for healthcare and income support for affected households and businesses. It's very clear what the assistance is directed towards, and that's a very specific commitment that countries have made. Second, we've also called for commitments, as I mentioned, on governance and transparency in the letters of intent. The focus is on measures that will not unduly delay this desperately needed financing, but still will provide transparency and accountability. So some of these commitments, just to give some examples of the ones that we particularly see recurring, commitments by countries to undertake a credible audit of crisis-related spending and to publish those audit reports. And we've seen this in a number of countries. In fact, some of these reports are already beginning to come out. Another set of commitments is to publish crisis-related procurement contracts, including information on companies awarded a contract, including information on the beneficial owners. Also commitments to validate the delivery of services and products under these contracts. Again, we're beginning to see in some cases that beneficial ownership information and some of these contracts are now being published on the websites and in other places by several countries. There have also been commitments made regarding fiscal and public financial management measures. For example, the use of a treasury single account, the use of special allocation accounts to manage the emergency financing, the use of specific budget lines to facilitate the tracking and reporting of this emergency financing. Countries also all commit to undergo what we in the IMF call a safeguards assessment, which is an assessment that to look at the central bank to confirm that there are adequate assurances for the use of resources, both IMF and other resources, that there's adequate governance reporting and controls for that purpose. I should also mention that in addition to these commitments, which again, we will be monitoring implementation of, and I'll say a little bit more about that, but we've also provided technical assistance to countries and are looking to do more to help them implement some of these commitments. So around things like beneficial ownership, tracking company information, transparency of company ownership. We're also designing a program right now to strengthen the capacity of the state audit institutions. In some countries, these audit reports will be done by those institutions. In other countries, they'll be done by independent audit agencies. But we're also going to be actively providing capacity development assistance to help in that respect. And in terms of just implementation, this is not something that is just a one-off. The IMF engages with our member countries on a regular basis. I mentioned earlier the Article 4 consultations. I mentioned multi-year financing arrangements. I mentioned also our ongoing capacity development. So those will all be avenues where we will be on a going forward basis looking at these issues. I should also mention that something like the Article 4 reports, these annual consultations that we have of our members, is not only about giving advice for countries receiving emergency financing. If you look at the report we issued a couple of weeks ago for the United States, you'll see that there's a discussion in there of the need for governance and for oversight to be paid with respect to all the money being spent, even in countries like the US. So really, this is an ongoing effort. And I think I'm just going to conclude by emphasizing again the importance of the role that civil society plays in helping us in these areas and how closely we have valued that partnership over the years and look forward to it in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rhoda. And indeed, I mean, definitely a layout of a broad architecture, but then not surprisingly, I mean, $30 billion US, I mean, being churned out to help 80 countries is a massive effort. And that stands then next to the massive accountability measures required to ensure that indeed the penny which are attributed or should go to those who need it most will get it. So that was extremely interesting and definitely helping the conversation. And that brings me, Gavin, to my last question. It's a bit of a rhetorical one, because at the end of the day, we are here in the C20, and the C20 is trying to influence the G20. But the question is indeed, I mean, who should drive this conversation towards reforming and strengthening accountability? It sounds a bit of a simple question, but it has really implications, as we as well have heard from Rhoda, with regard to how we work together cross-sectoral. The floor is yours, Gavin.
Thank you. So I guess as we move from that emergency response towards recovery, it's been quite clear that there have been fundamental flaws in many governments' national response that has enabled corruption and malfeasance. So I think there needs to be a focus on systematic reforms to prevent those in future, but also to fix the kind of underlying rot that's been shown in various different systems. And to be fair, we've seen that where certain governments, including I think South Africa and Kenya, both of their presidents have stepped up and said, this is not good enough. You know, we've had multiple procurement scandals now related to the COVID-19 pandemic response, so we need to fix the system more generally. So hopefully it's going to turn into many national conversations to deal with that sort of situation. Core to that change, therefore, to go back to what I was saying earlier, will really be about building a kind of sufficiently strong coalition of change, right, to get real systemic reforms coming in and actually sort of fixing the problems rather than just putting a few patches on them. I think the vital need there is really to connect the reformers in government, both to each other, but also to civil society and to businesses and other actors who have an interest in systemic reform from the outside. And one academic has this really pleasing image, what they call the sandwich strategy, where you have kind of top down and bottom up power pushing together, and they're trying to squeeze out the kind of vested interest in the middle, as it were, the sort of the filling of the sandwich. So that kind of idea feels really important for me as we kind of move into multiple national conversations about how we fix things that we've seen. I don't think it really matters where it begins, but it's really about that change of more people have to win from the change system. So how do we recruit all the allies we need to really get change to stick? And I think that's absolutely vital. Now, key on that, therefore, is working inside and outside government, and that takes trust, and trust has to be earned, right? You're not going to turn accountability, transparency into accountability unless you really are giving people the right to use information, agency, and you're putting it in the hands of people such that they can act on it. And I think there's been a couple of comments there in the chat from different people. So, yeah, Khaled was asking, how is civil society working to sort of save lives in the pandemic? And we've seen a lot of civic and government response work that's really helped shown what you can do. So a great example that I know really well would be the Do Zoro civil society community in Ukraine. They've been taking Ukraine's real-time public procurement information and tracking the awards of masks, of vital PPE, of hospital kind of medicines, everything else, and looking at the prices and the spending and making sure that those are being spent properly and accountably. Another kind of example might be the GeoBing mask app, where it's in Taiwan, but effectively it's a collaboration between civic tech enthusiasts and pharmacists and the pandemic response experts in the Taiwanese government to really make sure that they have real-time information on who's got masks and to help sort of provide the information. Again, that issue of how you build trust by engaging civil society. So we are the C20. It is worth saying, of course, in terms of the recommendation of the G20, there are countries in the G20 who have not yet really got the message about the importance of engaging civil society, right? And let's be honest, there are several members of the G20, including our current host, Saudi Arabia, where there are fundamental challenges of rule of law, human rights, and civic space. And critics are regularly detained or potentially even killed. And it's worth saying there are lots of international actors outside this process who aren't taking part in the C20 because they are really calling on Saudi Arabia to get serious about these reforms, and they're calling for the release of women's rights activists who've been imprisoned. And I totally support them on that. And it's important to repeat those messages inside and outside this forum. So I think during the pandemic, we've seen the importance of civil society in helping improve the response, and therefore encouraging that civic voice and making space for it is important within the G20 process. So if I look to what the G20 is going to do, hopefully there's going to be a high-level statement about the importance of transparency and accountability in the COVID-19 response, and there will be a really powerful statement there about how we turn transparency into accountability, how we support civil society, and then, from my point of view, also how we embed principles like oath contracting and the full pandemic kind of procurement response and the transparency of that into that sort of statement, so that people can follow the money and see it being spent properly, and that will save lives. We know it is saving lives. I've been really moved to see how a small civil society group that works on patients' rights in Moldova called Positive Initiative. They worked on HIV and TB, have really responded to the crisis by engaging the government, building a like a government civil society platform to track, again, procurement in real time, and using the oath contracting data standard to provide that data to really help power up the pandemic response. So, we've talked about systemic reform by governments. Let's talk about the international actors. So we've spoken about the G20 and their need to really not only make commitments, but also to follow up on those commitments. So one of the weaknesses in past G20s has been a lot of high-level commitments. The implementation has always been lacking. So I think the credibility of the implementation and the clear implementation plan really, really matters. I've been super impressed, just seeing the IMF's response in action, I'll be honest with you. And there's been really clear commitments that governments have made to spending the IMS money properly, with full disclosure of the whole contracting process and the beneficial owners of the companies receiving the money. That's great. I would love to see the IMF making sure we have that follow-up. It was great to hear either talk about the importance of civil society in that process. So I think a definite hat tip to the IMF. Full disclosure, we think that our guide as the Oath Contracting Partnership and how to collect, publish and visualize COVID-19 procurement information is a really useful technical resource. And I know that the IMF is thinking about how to provide better technical assistance to countries to meet their commitments. So hopefully that will be a productive conversation between us and them to give people the best possible advice. And as I said, we've seen loads of great examples that we can share to inspire others. If I may, just in closing, the World Bank. So the IMF needs to walk the walk, having talked the talk. The World Bank actually needs to talk the talk. I'll be honest with you, I felt their pandemic response has been pretty weak on governance and anti-corruption. I haven't seen anything like the quality of engagement, high-level messaging that we've seen from the IMF. So if I may use my bully pulpit as civil society to really push on that. And then I'm really excited for the UNODC to lead that conversation on the UN General Assembly special session on corruption next year. We've recognized how important it is to embed transparency and accountability into the pandemic response, how vital that has been to better spending of the money to make sure as many lives are saved as possible. And so I can't see how we shouldn't be having a conversation on what we've all learned from this. And from my point of view, the importance of end-to-end transparency of public spending, budgets and procurement, and great information about the recipients of those contracts, and the power of open data. People, I think Jesus in the comments was talking about the power of intermediaries and civil society to really make that data sing and to give people voice needs to be fully recognized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and thank you very much as well. I did see that we have replied, to questions which were related by Khaled Bibshait, who was asking how civil societies contribute to saving lives. Gavin, you took that on. I'm looking. Perhaps, Olivia, if you could go to the gallery view now, then we can see all our panel members together on the screen. That would be nice. Vivek, I'm happy to see that you're back, because for the audience, they might not know, but we had some technical problems, but that seems to be resolved. So I'm delighted to see that you're back on track. We had, so far 2 questions, and Gavin touched on them. First was indeed, how do civil societies contribute to saving lives? Well, in the current pandemic, and I think Tracy in the Global Funds, that is for you a daily issue. So I would like you to come back to that one. And the second question was of Jesus Melendez Vicente on the data and using Estonia as an example. Gavin, again, I mean, you said how important it is, I mean, to build that data literacy, that capacity which is required to make sense of all that data, a massive amount of data available. I am looking to the panel if anybody would like to take that on, but I will start with giving the floor on how we contribute to saving lives by having more accountability, more transparency, more integrity with Tracy, if you don't mind.
Sure, thank you, Jean-Luc. I mean, I think at the risk of sort of repeating myself, I mean, for me, the biggest contribution that civil society can make here is to participate. So I think I can break that down into two things. One is to get yourself a seat around the table, and then when you get a seat around the table, really use that to make sure that that all voices are heard. And the reason I single out participation for me is because, particularly from a global fund perspective, but I think also from everyone's perspective here, having that involvement and having those voices heard really enriches our programs and really makes sure that actually we're tackling the right things. And I think this is something that the Global Fund has, it's put it at the heart of its operations, that we do not know the best thing to do in every country. We do have a base knowledge of things that we think work very well in tackling our 3 diseases. But at the same time, we're humble enough to say we don't know everything, actually. And sometimes there are very location specific, but also population specific solutions to things. So I think, for me, there's real and tangible benefits from encouraging participation of all stakeholders. I think our programs, our grants are made far richer as a result of participation. So I think in terms of what civil society can do, I mean, it's limitless. As I say, get yourself around the table if you're not already around the table, and then secondly, use that that position that you'll have to really help drive the reforms and the ideas that you have. Over.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I mean, very helpful indeed. Vivek, I'm sure that you would like to contribute, I mean, with regard to both data and the role of the civil society. So feel free to follow up on Tracy's statements here. Vivek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Both those questions are in some ways related because civil society has an important role in being an intermediary. But to start with, look, the most important role that civil society can play is speaking truth to power. It all actually begins with that. Many times governments can, because of the ways in which their systems are designed, massive systems, they can miss out on targeting those who are most in need. Sometimes it is because of actual conniving of unscrupulous officials. So there's a proactive action that is taken. At times like the pandemic, when there is a lot of media attention being also pointed at flaws in government implementation, governments can be defensive, and their reactions can often be to stamp down on any criticism. And civil society organizations can be extremely vulnerable in such cases. But somebody needs to still speak the truth, and civil society organizations have a critical role in playing that. They can both point out to when governments are designing programs that are actually not reaching people, or when folks are actually included in the programs, but the implementation of the program is not working correctly. But it doesn't always have to be confrontational. There can be actual coalitions and alliances built between civil society and governments. And we have seen that in a number of countries. In South Africa, for example, and I'd mentioned this in one of my earlier comments, civil society groups have set up a system in the townships across the country to be able to routinely survey residents in these townships on whether they are getting access to water and sanitation facilities. And every week, that data is then being provided to national, provincial, and local government agencies, who are then able to use that data to channel their water and sanitation programs towards those townships, those neighborhoods that are lacking these services. In Senegal, the initial government COVID response missed out on the disabled communities, but civil society groups reached out to the government. And the government was receptive to their inputs, as a result of which 50,000 families in the country now are part of the response package that the government has developed. And a representative from the disabled community sits on the government advisory group on COVID responses. So we know that also civil society can work with governments on these issues. And finally, the point on playing the role of intermediaries and intermediaries in terms of translating complex government information, policy information, and on the one hand, and passing that on to the public so that they can understand what the government's plans are or what the government is actually doing. Civil society is playing an important role on this front. We work with a network of civil society groups across more than 100 countries that are playing precisely this type of a role of using complex and translating complex budget information into formats that people can understand. And in turn, also taking the voice of the public into technical discussions with governments where budget discussions are happening. So civil society can play an important role as an intermediary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vivek. And yes, I mean, speaking truth to power is extremely important. I mean, let me point out, I mean, that from the way we see it here within the United Nations system, we see multilateralism under pressure. I mean, we see that some of the national acts work very well extraterritorial, and let's not be misunderstanding. I mean, happily that action is being taken. I mean, think about the United States 1997 Foreign Bribery Act, but it indicates, I mean, that something with the multilateral framework is not really working properly at this moment. Many of you might have been involved, or some of you might have been involved in the exercises ongoing in New York at this moment, the financial accountability and transparency integrity discussions, FACTI, ongoing, in which some of the civil society have been included. More recently, and definitely something the IMF, together with so many other multilaterals, have taken a great interest in, is the financing for development for COVID-19 recovery. And one of the discussion groups within that was indeed, I mean, illicit financial flows. There were 6 discussion groups dealing with different aspects of socioeconomic recovery, but one was really related on illicit financial flows. How can we keep money where it is really required to be? Having said that, Rhoda, you mentioned before as well, criminal justice is not the sole solution. But if you look a little bit on the recent big global scandals, I mean, the 2020 FinCEN, the 2019 Paradise Papers, the 2018 Panama Papers, and we can go back and back and back. I mean, this has never been really the work of institutional prosecution. I mean, this has been whistleblowers, leakages, investigatory media. The role here of those, and Vivek, I come back to what you say, speaking truth to power is really often in parallel of what institutionally we already have been putting in place. Any of you would like to react on that? Rhoda, go ahead, please.
I'm happy to come in. I mean, just to echo, and I think the two are related, because when you talk about the role of whistleblowers and, again, external, civil groups of various kinds, I couldn't agree more. The media, civil society plays such a powerful role in all of these areas. Again, I don't want to repeat, because I think Vivek and other colleagues have really covered the role of civil society. But this point about speaking truth to power, I want to say also that there's an element that relates to the IMF, because I think civil society does a huge job speaking truth to power at the IMF in terms of pushing us to do better and to do different. And that's a role that we also, very much appreciate. Also, this idea of sort of helping to enable civil society, again, some of the points that others made, that's something we've been very keen on. Almost every IMF country mission routinely meets with civil society and others on the ground. Again, when you talk about investigative reports and those kinds of things, we're also engaged with the media, we're engaged with others on the ground. but also trying to help create conditions in countries where civil society can have a bigger voice. We've organized workshops with the authorities in several countries. We, in some cases, have even requested civil society involvement, like on budget committees and other important economic committees where this was important for a country's program. So just saying that dimension of both collaboration, but speaking truth to power is something that resonates hugely for us. I also wanted to, and again, that includes Jean-Luc in this context of the Paradise Papers and others that you've talked about. This whole set of work around illicit financial flows is something the IMF has been doing a huge amount on. AML-CFT is a big part of our focus on governance and corruption. We work very closely with FATF and others in that space. I also wanted, just on a very practical note regarding the IMF's COVID response, I wanted to be clear that on our website right now, we have what we call the COVID tracker, which has the commitment made by every country we've provided emergency financing to. So I encourage all members, all of our civil society colleagues to look at that website, find your country, and use that as sort of a tool to engage with, your government and others to push on the implementation of those commitments as well. The final quick thing I wanted to say is, you talk about data and civil society providing inputs there. We launched an anti-corruption challenge at the IMF about a year ago. We got over 120 submissions. Civil society was involved in almost every one of those, both local and global CSOs. We have the finale today where we're going to pick the 4 winners. And again, I think all of the 8 finalist teams have civil society organizations, if not all of them, certainly the vast majority that are part of it. So I'm just saying there's so many different levels for this engagement, and it's so valuable. I can't thank you enough for what you do, and look forward to more of it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda. And indeed, Vivek, you mentioned as well that it does not always need to be confrontational. It can go very symbiotic. And I started the session by laying out, that we in UNODC are trying to engage civil society, academia, private sector within the review mechanism, which is established, to have member states to review where they stand with regard to the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption. I can tell you that for those countries who have undergone the second review, more than 90% of them have invited academia, civil society, and private sector to be part of that review. So that's indeed a good token, that we have that symbiotic joint effort. Gavin, you'd call that the sandwich, from top and the bottom, but the cheese in the middle can be very hefty. I give you, the last few minutes, and then I look around if somebody else would like to finish this. But Gavin, you go ahead now.
Sure, yes. As you said, the cheese can be hefty, and the vested interests can push back very hard. So I think it is worth reflecting. We've all recognized the power of civil society. That space needs defending because it's under attack and is very, very fragile. So exactly as you were saying, Jean-Luc, and as Rhoda was saying, using the international mechanisms and leverage that the IMF or UNODC has to invite civil society in and give them a space is very important, and to defend that, right? And to make sure that it's kind of helping model best practices that others should be copying. So I think that's my reflection on that, recognizing the fragility of it. It's more under attack than ever before, so we need to defend that space more than ever before and kind of show that power. So I found it really useful to hear Rhoda and Tracy talking about how they're trying to bring civil society in, to give them a voice and to listen, and to kind of give them some international legitimacy and protection. So I think that's super important. Reflecting on the Panama Papers, the FinCEN links and everything else, and the FACTI, which is the high-level panel for financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. Yeah, I think that's showing is there are still fundamental deficits in the rule of law and holes in the fence of our international anti-money laundering framework. So one of the really important things, for example, is beneficial ownership. So to really understand how people are able to hide their assets in offshore jurisdictions, and not just offshore jurisdictions as in Caribbean islands. Let's be honest, the role of the City of London and Delaware, New York and others in, like Switzerland, in enabling that. You call them the enablers, right? The lawyers, the bagmen, the accountants that have been hiding those assets. And I, in a past life, have gone undercover before to talk to like corporate formation agents and others to see just how they work to hide what is, to all intents and purposes, the proceeds of corruption. So I really want to draw everyone's attention to, it's not just something for local reforms. We need international reforms, and to think through that kind of international anti-money laundering framework and make sure things like beneficial ownership are embedded across the kind of board cross-jurisdictionally. Thanks.
Excellent, Gavin. I mean, Vivek, you would like to come in here, feel free to do so. And if I don't see anybody else who would like, then I will close off after Vivek. But if there is still somebody else who would like to take the floor, we have the last 3 minutes. Vivek, you can start.
Thank you, Jean-Luc, and I'll keep this really brief. We touched on this topic of confrontation with government, collaboration with governments, but we also know that governments are not monoliths. The G20 is not a monolith. International organizations are not monoliths. There are reform-minded folks there. There are folks who are willing to support certain kinds of policies. And the role that civil society organizations, and I hope through this panel that we can touch in these processes and discussions that are happening, is that at this moment, a lot of the efforts are going in the right directions in terms of governments paying attention to what their citizens need. But we also know that there's going to be great pressure on governments to restrict their fiscal envelopes because of the high levels of debt that are coming in, because of pressures to reduce taxes as part of the economic recovery that will take place. And what might be inevitable, which we certainly hope does not happen unless, and civil society here has a big role to play in preventing it from happening, is to ensure that next year's budgets don't see a cut in the programs or a let up in the efforts to provide support to vulnerable populations. We know that the SDGs are going to take a big hit as a result of the pandemic. More people are now in poverty. Now more than ever, it is especially urgent that governments keep providing the kinds of support that people need and don't look at some of the more traditional responses that they've had to previous economic recovery efforts that have resulted in constrained spending and money going towards people who desperately need that support now.
Thank you, Vivek. I mean, one of the how would you say it? I mean, the indicators of a successful panel discussion is when the panel members cannot stop talking to each other. I mean, regardless from the audience. But we are really coming to an end now. And I will give very fast, Tracy. I mean, 30 seconds, but it's yours. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. I mean, I've got sort of two things. One, an optimistic comment, and one is a pessimistic quote, or rather a call to action. The first one, starting off with the pessimism, anything that's worth doing, is really hard. So I think it was Teddy Roosevelt that said, nothing in the world that's worth having, worth doing, doesn't come with effort, pain, and difficulty. And I would just say, keep doing what you're doing in terms of civil society. But I think, I'm an optimist by nature. And I think, what we're seeing right now, it kind of feels like we've got real momentum shift, real discussions on inclusivity and transparency and accountability like we've never really seen on a global stage. And so for me, that is part of this movement. This is how we keep it going. So I would just, as an optimist, just say keep going.
And Tracy, we could not end better than on this optimistic mode. I mean, I have the same feel. We do see momentum. We now talk about the financing for development. I mean, Rhoda is very familiar with that exercise as well. This is basically Jamaica and Canada pushing that forward. We talk about FACTI, that is Nigeria and Norway. We really see that kind of a feel, that momentum. But up to us all, cross-sectoral, civil society, international, you just name it, to make sure that that momentum continues and does not end as many fashions we have seen in the past. We need to push this through to the end. Vivek, Rhoda, Tracy, Gavin, it has been my pleasure to be your moderator. Again, I guess that the four of us could continue another hour or three after this panel closes. Regretfully, we go back to our jobs and continue the good battle from where we are, respectively. thanks as well to the audience, for staying with us, and wishing you all good luck. And definitely, hopefully, the outcomes of this session will influence the G20 debates in ways it should be. Thank you, and have a nice day. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.